They thought humans were just myths, until the first warships opened fire. Part 1. The Legend No One Believed. The council chamber on Sorveth Prime was never quiet. It was a place of noise and motion, dozens of alien voices talking over each other, data screens flickering on every wall, and the low hum of the station's massive engines, always vibrating through the floor. The Vaelthari Conclave had been running the galaxy for 4,000 years, and they were proud of it. They had absorbed 63 species into their empire. They had fought and won more wars than most civilizations could count, and on this particular morning, they were laughing. The reason for the laughter was a report. A young intelligence analyst named Zyron Doss had placed it on the council table after a routine border survey. Most of the report was boring. Dust fields, dead star systems, nothing of value. But buried at the very bottom, in a small footnote that Zyron Doss had almost deleted before thinking twice, was a single observation. Faint signals, repeating in a clear pattern, coming from a remote star system in the spiral arm. The system was catalogued under an old name, Sol. That was why they were laughing. Sol was a ghost story. Every Vaelthari child heard about it at some point. A tiny, warm star system at the edge of known space that had once, supposedly, been home to a species called humans. The old folklore described them as strange creatures. Soft bodies, no natural armor, no venom, no claws worth mentioning. They breathed oxygen and bled easily. They had very short lives compared to most intelligent species. And strangest of all, according to the old stories, they had spent most of their brief existence fighting each other. Wars over land, over resources, over ideas, over things that barely made sense to any outside observer. The precursor records, the oldest data archives the Vaelthari had ever recovered, described humans as passionate, loud, and deeply violent toward their own kind. The working theory among Vaelthari scholars was simple. The humans had destroyed themselves. Every model said the same thing. A species that wars with itself that aggressively does not last. It was only a matter of when. The council laughed, filed the report, and moved on to other business. Zyron Doss sat quietly in his seat and said nothing. But he did not delete the footnote. On the other side of the galaxy, in a star system the Vaelthari had written off as a graveyard, the signals were still sending. Dale Ortiz was not a man who smiled often on duty. He had a square jaw, tired eyes, and the kind of calm that came not from being relaxed, but from having trained for everything that could go wrong. He was the commanding officer of the Resolute Dawn, a dreadnought carrier that sat in high orbit above the shipyard platforms circling Titan. From where he stood on the command deck, he could see 3 new frigates being fitted with their final hull plating. They were big ships, sharp-lined and dark, built for a fight that might never come, or might come very soon. Earth had been building for a long time. Not just ships. Everything. Defense platforms, orbital relay stations, long-range sensor networks, strike carrier groups, research facilities hidden deep in the asteroid belt. For over 200 years, ever since a deep space survey team had stumbled onto something they were not supposed to find, humanity had been preparing. What they found at the edge of the Oort cloud had not been friendly. The debris was the first thing, enormous broken hulls drifting in the dark, scorched along the sides in patterns that only made sense if you understood weapons fire. Then, the signal fragments, buried in the wreckage. Partial communications in languages no human had ever heard. And eventually, after years of study, the slow and terrible understanding that the galaxy was not empty. It was full. And whatever was out there had already been at war for a very long time. Humanity made a decision at that point. Not everyone agreed with it. There were long arguments in every government building on Earth and Mars, and across the colonies. Some people said humanity should reach out, send greetings, try to make contact peacefully. Some said humanity should hide and hope to never be noticed. But the decision that won in the end was the one that looked at the scorched debris of at least 3 different alien civilizations and came to a simple conclusion. Preparation was better than hope. So they built, quietly and without broadcasting a single signal that could give away how much they had grown. Scientists developed new propulsion systems and shield technology and weapons that would have seemed impossible a century earlier. Entire generations of humans were born, trained, and dedicated their lives to a defense fleet that most of the civilian population only half believed would ever be needed. Dale was one of those people. He had joined the United Earth Defense Fleet at 18 and worked his way up through 30 years of patrol duty, training operations, and quiet monitoring missions. He had never fired his ship's weapons at another vessel. He sometimes wondered if he ever would, but he trained as though the answer was yes, and he made sure every officer under his command did the same. On this particular day, standing at the wide observation window of the Resolute Dawn's command deck, he was watching the frigates at Titan when Lieutenant Nina Carr spoke up from her station behind him. "Commander," she said, and something in her voice made him turn immediately. Nina was his communications officer and one of the sharpest people on the ship. She did not use that tone unless something was real. She was leaning forward at her console, fingers moving quickly across the display. "I'm picking up a scan," she said. "Not ours. It's coming from outside the outer sensor buoys. Someone swept across them about 40 seconds ago." Dale walked to her station and looked at the screen. The scan pattern was methodical and careful, the kind of sweep a scout vessel would make when trying to get a picture of a system without being seen. Whoever was doing it was good, but Nina was better. "How many times?" he asked. "Just once so far," she said, "but the signature doesn't match anything in our database." Dale straightened up. He looked out the window at the shipyard, at the 3 frigates, at the dozens of other vessels moving in their patrol patterns across the system. 230 years of preparation, and now, maybe, the moment it had all been building toward. He did not panic. He did not raise his voice. He walked back to his command chair, sat down, and keyed the fleet-wide channel. "All vessels," he said, "go to standby status. Maintain current positions. Do not power up weapons arrays. We are being watched, and we are going to let them look." He paused, then added quietly to Nina, "Keep that signal tracked. I want to know exactly where they are." Nina nodded and got to work. Outside, the stars were still. The solar system looked peaceful from a distance. It always did. But underneath that stillness, something was shifting. The long silence of 200 years was finally ending, and the galaxy was about to learn that the old ghost story was very much alive. They thought humans were just myths, until the first warships opened fire. Part 2. First contact is not a handshake. The Veilthari scout vessel Sorveth Inquiry was not built for war. It was a light survey ship, small, fast, and designed for quiet observation work in unknown systems. Its crew of 12 was mostly scientists and analysts. Their mission was simple: go to the Sol system, confirm that the signals were some kind of natural phenomenon or old automated beacon, and come back with data. No contact, no engagement. Clean and fast. The mission leader was a field surveyor named Zelth Avaris. He was a careful, methodical alien who had spent 30 years cataloging dead planets and drifting debris fields. He had a reputation for patience and a deep dislike of surprises. His second-in-command was not like him at all. Drew Vectau was war-cast. He was younger, broader, and had the kind of confidence that came from having never been in a situation he could not talk or fight his way out of. He had been assigned to the mission as a military escort, standard procedure for any deep survey into uncharted territory. He was not supposed to make decisions. He was supposed to be a precaution. The Sorveth inquiry dropped out of transit at the far edge of the Sol system, and immediately cut all active signals. They ran on silent mode, passive sensors only, drifting in the dark at the outer edge of what the old records marked as the system boundary. Zelthaveris sat at the survey console and began the first long-range sweep. What he saw made him go very still. The system was alive. Not just a little alive, loudly, undeniably, unmistakably alive. Long-range imaging showed structured orbital traffic around multiple planetary bodies. There were ring-shaped stations in orbit around the large gas planet. There were extraction platforms spread across a dense asteroid cluster. Communication signals were bouncing between objects in tight, coded bursts, and moving through all of it in patterns that Zelthaveris recognized immediately as coordinated patrol formations, were ships. Not one or two, not a handful. He updated the scan and counted again. Then again. Hundreds. "Pull back," Zelthaveris said. His voice was flat and quiet. "We are leaving. Right now." He reached for the transit controls. Druvek Tal put his hand over the console. There was a long pause. The two of them looked at each other, in the dim light of the survey bridge. The rest of the crew said nothing. Druvek Tal's reasoning, which he laid out in a calm and even tone, was this. The Veilthari Conclave had absorbed species far more advanced than these signals suggested. Whatever was in that system had not left it. They had no evidence of any presence beyond Sol's borders, which meant they were contained, local, probably pre-transit. The Conclave's standard procedure for any newly discovered inhabited system was demonstration of superiority, followed by formal absorption negotiations. There was no reason to run. There was every reason to establish dominance early, before the system's inhabitants had a chance to organize a response. Besides, Druvek Tal added, these were humans, a species so self-destructive they had supposedly erased themselves. If they were still here, they were likely a primitive remnant, scraping by on whatever they had managed not to blow up. Then he said, very quietly, that the patrol formations below did not look primitive to him. Druvek Tal overrode him, invoked his military authority, and took the weapons console. The nearest human vessel was a mid-class frigate running a patrol arc, about 200,000 kilometers inside the system boundary. It was a clean-hulled ship, well-maintained, moving at a steady and unhurried speed. Druvek Tal targeted a patch of empty space 2 kilometers off its bow, and fired a single directed energy burst. A warning shot. Standard Veilthari intimidation protocol. A message that said, simply, we see you, we are armed, and you should be afraid. The burst traveled at the speed of light. It hit empty space, exactly where he aimed it. What happened next did not follow the script. On the bridge of the Earth frigate ICS Endeavour, Lieutenant Nina Carr's counterpart, a sensor officer named Pete Dunn, had been tracking the Sorveth inquiry's position for 11 minutes. Not because it had done anything aggressive. Because it had dropped out of transit inside the system boundary and gone quiet. And quiet unidentified objects at the edge of a watched system were always interesting. When the weapons discharge happened, Pete Dunn had already tagged the firing point and had the data package ready to send before the burst even finished traveling. Commander Alicia Voss of the Endeavour was a short woman with a calm face and 20 years of deep space patrol experience. She read the alert on her screen, looked at Pete Dunn, and confirmed what she already knew. Then she keyed her comm. Resolute Dawn, this is Voss. They just shot first. That was all. On the Resolute Dawn, Dale Ortiz set down the cup of coffee he had been holding for the past hour and reached for his command console. He had a plan for this. He had run simulations of this exact scenario 37 times. His hands were steady. All frigates on outer patrol Execute Shepherd 7, he said. Do not open fire. I repeat, do not open fire. Containment only. Shepherd 7 was not a combat formation. It was a cage. 4 frigates peeled out of their patrol routes and moved at full thrust toward the position of the Sorveth Inquiry. They came in fast and from different angles, and within 90 seconds, they had formed a perfect geometric formation around the alien vessel. 1 ship above, 1 below, 1 on each flank, all of them at close enough range that there was no exit vector that did not pass directly through a human hull. Their weapons were not pointed at the Sorveth Inquiry. They were pointed at the spaces between which any escape attempt would have to pass through. Inside the Sorveth Inquiry, the crew was silent. The survey screens showed 4 large human vessels closing in around them, with a speed and precision that none of them had ever seen outside of Veilthari fleet exercises. Zelthavaris watched the formation lock into place and felt something cold move through him. This was not a panicked response. This was a rehearsed one. Druvek Tal stood very still at the weapons console. His hands were no longer moving. Zelthavaris walked across the bridge, gently placed his hand on Druvek Tal's arm, and guided him away from the weapons station. Druvek Tal, to his credit, did not resist. He sat down in a corner of the bridge and stared at the screens with an expression that, in Veilthari body language, meant something close to deep regret. Zelthavaris powered down the weapons array. Then he opened a distress channel to Conclave Space and sent the most important message of his career. He kept it short. He said they had found the humans. He said the humans were not a myth. He said the humans had surrounded his ship in under 2 minutes and had not fired a single shot. He said, please send help, and please send someone with authority to negotiate. The message took 3 days to reach Sorveth Prime. When it did, the council chamber fell into a silence that no one present had ever experienced before. Every screen, every voice, every movement stopped. The reports sat on the table like something heavy and alive. The laughter from 3 days ago seemed very far away now. They thought humans were just myths until the first warships opened fire. Part 3. The Weight of Human History. The news did not stay quiet for long. Within a week of Zelthavaris' distress signal reaching Sorveth Prime, the information had moved through every layer of the Veilthari Conclave's government. The High Command tried to keep it contained, tried to manage the story. But 17 species made up the Conclave, and 17 species meant 17 different intelligence networks, and at least 4 of them had intercepted the original message before the High Command could lock it down. By the end of the second week, it was everywhere. The humans were real, and they had a fleet. Back on Earth, the debate was loud and very human. The Global Senate met in emergency session in Geneva, and the chamber looked exactly the way it always did when something genuinely serious was happening. Too many people talking at the same time, not enough of them listening. The session had been going for 6 hours before anyone managed to get the room under control long enough to hear a proper argument. Humanity had a chance here, maybe the most important chance in its entire history, to introduce itself as something other than a military threat, to be the calm voice, to show the galaxy what humans could be when they chose patience over aggression. She sat down to a mixed response. Some applause, some silence. A few people in the back rows crossed their arms. Admiral Frank Cawley spoke next. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of voice that did not need a microphone. He had commanded the Mars Defense Command for 9 years, and had spent most of those years reading intelligence reports about what lay beyond the solar system. He did not share Grace's optimism, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He pulled up a screen behind him. On it was a map of the known debris fields at the outer edge of the Oort cloud, wreckage his analysts had been cataloging for years. 3 distinct hull types. 3 distinct civilizations. All of them destroyed in patterns consistent with directed energy weapons and hull breaches caused by external force. Not accidents, not natural causes. Someone had done this to them, and whoever had done it had moved on without leaving a note. Frank looked at the chamber and said what he always said when he presented this data. The galaxy was not a friendly place. The Viletary Conclave had been expanding and absorbing and erasing for 4,000 years. Humanity had built its fleet for exactly this moment, and the correct response to being probed by the most powerful empire in the known galaxy was not to send them a fruit basket. It was to make absolutely clear that the cost of taking Earth was higher than the Conclave was willing to pay. Grace Pullman, from across the chamber, said that threatening an empire of 17 species with a fleet they had not yet fully measured was not strategy, it was pride. Frank said that being unprepared was not peace. It was an invitation. The two of them went back and forth for another 2 hours, while the rest of the Senate watched like people watching a very old, very important argument that had been going on since before any of them were born. Dale Ortiz arrived at Geneva the following morning. He had not asked to be summoned. The Senate had sent for him because he was the man who had handled the containment, and they wanted his read on the situation. He walked into the chamber in his uniform, sat at the table they had prepared for him, and waited while the senators finished their questions about procedure and chain of command. Then Grace Pullman asked him the question that mattered. She asked if he believed peace was possible with the Viletary Conclave. Dale thought about it for a moment, not because he did not know his answer, but because he wanted to give her the honest one rather than the easy one. He said that he did not know if peace was possible. What she knew was that the decoded fragments from the Viletary communications burst, which Dr. Kevin Marsh and his linguistics team at the Europa Institute had been working on for 4 days straight, told a very clear story about what the Conclave was. It was an empire built on absorption. Every species it encountered was either brought in on Conclave terms or removed as an obstacle. The debris at the Oort cloud was not random. It was a pattern, and humanity was sitting at the next point in that pattern. He said that whether peace was possible or not, preparation was not optional. And he said that the best chance humanity had of achieving peace was to enter any negotiation from a position that made conflict look more expensive than agreement. There was a long silence after that. The vote, when it finally happened, was closer than Frank would have liked, and wider than Grace had feared. Humanity would not send a war fleet, but it would not send a single diplomatic shuttle either. The response would be a formal envoy, 1 senior diplomat, 1 support team, and 40 warships as escort. A message that said humanity was willing to talk, and also willing to not talk. While all of this was happening in Geneva, a very different kind of conversation was taking place in orbit above Jupiter. The Sorveth Inquiry was still there, held in containment by the 4 frigates of Shepherd 7, which had been quietly resupplied and rotated through crew rest shifts without ever breaking the formation. The alien crew had been given access to a communications line for basic needs. They had not been mistreated. They had not been boarded. They had simply been told politely that they were guests for the time being, and that their needs would be taken care of. The human assigned to manage daily communication with the alien vessel was Ensign Cal Reeves. He was 24 years old, from a small city in Idaho, and had been chosen for the assignment primarily because he had scored highest in the fleet on patience assessments and cross-cultural communication training. He had a slow, easy way of speaking that the translation interface handled well, and he never seemed uncomfortable with silence. Zelth Avarice, for his part, had decided that if he was going to be held in orbit around a gas giant by a species that had trapped his ship with the casual efficiency of someone catching a fish, he might as well try to understand them. He asked to speak with whoever was assigned to his vessel. Cal appeared on the screen. Their conversations were slow at first. Cal asked what Zelthavarus needed. Zelthavarus asked careful, clinical questions about human biology and social structure. Cal answered them without hesitation. When Zelthavarus asked why humans fed their prisoners, Cal looked a little confused and said that Zelthavarus was not a prisoner. He was a guest, and on Earth you fed guests because that was how you showed them you were not going to hurt them. Zelthavarus said his species showed non-aggression by lowering their head crests. Cal nodded at this very seriously, leaned forward, and tilted his head toward the camera in what was clearly an attempt to approximate the gesture. It was not quite right, but Zelthavarus found, to his own surprise, that the effort was more meaningful than the accuracy. A few days later, Cal pulled out a datapad and asked if Zelthavarus wanted to see something. He pulled up a video, short, recorded on a green lawn somewhere on Earth. In it, a four-legged animal with soft fur bounded toward a human child and pushed its face into the child's hands, tail moving rapidly back and forth. Zelthavarus watched it 3 times without speaking. Then he asked, in his own language, what the creature was for. Cal said it was a dog. He said humans had bred dogs over thousands of years to be companions, animals whose main purpose was to be near people and to be happy about it. Zelthavarus was quiet for a long time. Finally, in a tone his translation unit rendered as something between wonder and deep confusion, he said, "Your world made a living thing whose only purpose is to love you, and you kept it." Cal smiled and said, "Yeah, that was pretty much right." Neither of them knew the conversation was being recorded. Neither of them knew it would one day be studied in schools across 14 species. They were just 2 people, or 1 person and 1 alien, sitting across a communication screen, trying to understand each other. It was, in its own small way, the most human thing that had happened since the whole thing started. They thought humans were just myths, until the first warships opened fire. Part 4. When the myths came marching in. The Veilthari Conclave assembled its response fleet in just under 3 weeks. 46 vessels. It was the largest rapid deployment force the Conclave had put together in over 200 years, a show of strength that the High Command intended to be impossible to ignore. There were heavy cruisers, carrier-class ships, destroyer escorts, and a command vessel at the center that was nearly twice the size of anything else in the formation. They called it the Sorveth Vanguard, and its commander was a decorated war-cast veteran named Shreveth Dorn, who had led 3 successful absorption campaigns over his career, and had never lost a ship under his command. Shreveth Dorn was not worried. He had read the intelligence reports from the Sorveth Inquiry, and he had listened to the mission brief carefully. Yes, they had contained one of his survey vessels with impressive speed. But 46 warships represented the kind of force that ended arguments before they started. He had seen species with far more impressive home defenses than what the scouts had photographed, and every one of them had made the same calculation when the Vanguard arrived. The math was not complicated. You either negotiated on Veilthari terms, or you ceased to exist. The Sorveth Vanguard fleet dropped out of transit at the edge of the Sol system, and Shreveth Dorn's confidence lasted approximately 40 seconds. The humans were already there. Not a patrol, not a handful of watching ships, a full battle formation arranged in a wide forward arc stretching across the system's outer boundary. 62 warships, sitting perfectly still, as if they had known the exact transit point and had been waiting for a comfortable amount of time. Their shields were active, glowing faintly blue-white against the dark. Their weapons arrays were not powered up, which Shreveth Dorn found more unsettling than if they had been. It meant the humans did not feel they needed them yet. At the center of the formation, the largest human vessel held its position with an absolute steadiness that suggested a crew very much at ease. That was the Resolute Dawn. Shreveth Dorn's sensors identified it quickly. A dreadnought carrier, heavily armored, large enough to house a significant number of smaller craft in its bays. He ordered his fleet to stop and hold position. His communications officer confirmed an incoming hail from the human formation. Shreveth Dorn straightened, composed himself, and opened the channel. He was expecting fear or bluster, or the nervous over-formality of a species trying to appear more confident than it was. He had seen all three before, many times. What he got was Dale Ortiz, sitting in his command chair, holding a coffee cup. Dale looked at the screen for a moment, as if checking that the connection was good. Then he spoke in a calm, unhurried voice. He introduced himself by name and rank. He said that Earth was aware of the Veilthari conclave, and had been for some time. He said that humanity was not interested in being absorbed into the conclave's empire, and was also not interested in a war. He said that humanity understood the conclave's history, and had taken that history seriously over a long period of preparation. And he said that he was transmitting a data package at that moment that the conclave fleet was welcome to review at its convenience. Then he leaned back in his chair and waited. Shreveth Dorn's second-in-command, a sharp-minded officer named Vexal, opened the data package first. She started reading. Then she stopped. Then she started again from the beginning, more slowly. The package was a full disclosure document, not classified, not partial, complete. It laid out the entirety of humanity's military infrastructure in plain data. Ship counts by class and capability, orbital defense platform locations across every major planetary body in the Sol system, long-range sensor network coverage maps, command structure and redundancy systems, supply chain logistics, strike carrier group positions at 7 outer relay points. Vexal got to page 14 before she looked up at Shreveth Dorn, with an expression that said everything without saying anything. He took the package and kept reading. The total ship count across all of humanity's active defense fleet was 1,700 vessels. Not the 62 sitting in front of him, 1,700, deployed across the system in layered defensive rings. The defense platforms alone outnumbered his fleet 3-1. And at the very end of the document, formatted like a footnote, the way someone might add a quiet note at the bottom of a letter, was a short list. It was titled, Experimental Systems Not Yet Deployed. Shreveth Dorn read the list twice. Then, across the open communication channel that was still connected to the Resolute Dawn, his second-in-command asked quietly, in her own language, how long it would have taken a species to build all of this. She was not asking Dale. She was asking herself, thinking out loud. Dale answered anyway. A while, he said, in a tone that suggested he had heard the question clearly. We were patient. Vexal turned to look at the screen. Shreveth Dorn turned too. The channel had been open the entire time. Of course it had. The humans had been listening to their side of the conversation. Shreveth Dorn felt the edge of something he had not felt in a campaign in a very long time. It was the feeling of realizing you had walked into a room and the other person had already read the script. He did not give the order to fire. He sat in his command chair for a long moment, looking at the 62 ships arranged in their perfect formation, at the data package still open on his screen, at the calm face of a human commander who had 40 frigates in position and was still drinking his coffee. Then he told Vexal to open a response channel and begin formal contact proceedings. The news moved fast. Back at the Sorveth Prime Council chambers, the reports from the Vanguard fleet arrived in pieces, each one harder to process than the last. First the formation count, then the data package, then the quiet confirmation from Shreveth Dorn that he had decided to open talks rather than engage. The council chamber did not laugh this time. Among the 17 species of the conclave, the news hit differently depending on who you were. For the Veilthari High Command, it was a problem. a serious and complicated one that threatened the authority structure they had maintained for 4,000 years. But for some of the other species in the conclave, the ones who had been absorbed generations ago and had been living under Veilthari terms ever since, the news landed differently. The Areth Collective, whose homeworld had been brought into the conclave by force roughly 800 years ago, spent 3 days in closed session after receiving the human data package. The Vashan Union, who had been managing their resentment of Veilthari trade restrictions for over 2 centuries, quietly requested a full copy of the human tactical disclosure document through back channels. The question that circulated through all of them was the same. If the humans had built all of this without anyone knowing and had chosen to disclose it freely rather than use it aggressively, what kind of species did that make them? It was not the kind of question the conclave was used to asking. Dale, meanwhile, had handed off the communications duty to a specialist team and gone to get a proper meal for the first time in 3 days. He sat in the Resolute Dawn's mess hall with Nina Carr and Pete Dunn from the Endeavor, who had come aboard for a debrief, and the 3 of them ate without talking much. There was not a lot to say. The work was not done. The talks were just beginning, and beginning was always the easier part. But for the first time since the whole situation started, the situation felt like something other than the edge of a catastrophe. Pete Dunn asked Dale if he had expected it to go this way. Dale considered the question while finishing his food. He said he had expected one of 3 outcomes. One was that the Veilthari would fire, and that would settle the question of whether peace was possible. Another was that they would run, and they would go back and try to prepare something bigger. The third was this, that they would stop and read the data and think. I was hoping for the third one, he said. I planned for all 3. Pete nodded. Nina said nothing, but she refilled Dale's coffee cup, and that seemed to be enough. Outside, across the breadth of the solar system, 62 human warships held their positions in the dark, patient and quiet, the way they had been trained to be. And 46 Veilthari vessels sat across from them, still and uncertain, beginning the slow process of understanding something they had never expected to encounter. A species that had built a sword big enough to end the argument, and was choosing for now to keep it in its sheath. They thought humans were just myths, until the first warships opened fire. Part 5. What the Galaxy Learned About Humans. The talks took 6 months. That was not a long time by galactic standards. The Veilthari Conclave had conducted absorption negotiations that stretched across decades, but by human standards, 6 months of daily sessions in a pressurized conference module docked between the Resolute Dawn and the Veilthari command vessel was a long time to be very careful with every word. The delegation rooms smelled of recycled air, and whatever the Veilthari equivalent of strong tea was, and by the 3rd month, both sides had started leaving small food items on the shared table without being asked, which the diplomatic teams later agreed was probably the moment the whole thing started working. Earth's lead diplomat was Laura Voss. She was no relation to Commander Alicia Voss of the Endeavor. It was simply a common enough name that the coincidence had stopped being funny to anyone after the first week. Laura was 53, silver-haired, and had spent 20 years negotiating trade agreements between the Earth colonies and the independent stations at the asteroid belt. She was not a soldier, had no interest in being one, and walked into every negotiation session with the same unhurried posture that made the Veilthari delegations visibly uncomfortable, because they could not read what she was thinking. Her method was simple. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, she was specific, and she never, under any circumstances, let the other party rush her. She had a reputation in Earth diplomatic circles for sitting in silence long enough that the other side always filled it first, usually with something more useful than what they had planned to say. The Velthari lead negotiator was a senior council member named Previth Vaz, who was intelligent, experienced, and deeply unused to not being the most powerful entity in a room. The first 2 weeks were rough. Previth Vaz kept defaulting to conclave standard procedures, presenting terms for consideration, which was the polite Velthari way of presenting terms for acceptance. Laura would read the terms, put them aside, and ask a question about something else entirely. Previth Vaz found this maddening. His team found it baffling. By the third week, he had quietly started actually listening to her questions, because he had noticed they were always about something important, even when they seemed off topic. The core of what humanity wanted was not complicated. Recognized borders, sovereignty over the Sol system and all current human colonies, the right to expand into unclaimed space without conclave interference, mutual defense provisions that treated human ships as equals, not subjects, and formal acknowledgement that the 3 destroyed civilizations in the Oort cloud debris field were the result of conclave action, with consequences to be determined by a joint historical review. That last point was the hard one. Previth Vaz spent 3 sessions trying to move past it without addressing it directly. Laura let him try. Then, on the 4th session, she put a full set of the debris field analysis documents on the table, and said, very quietly, that she was happy to wait as long as necessary, but that this item was not going to be removed from the agenda. It stayed on the agenda. The treaty that emerged from 6 months of work was not a conclave absorption agreement. It was not a human victory document either. It was something rarer. A genuine framework for coexistence between 2 powers that had very different histories and roughly comparable reasons to avoid a war. Humanity entered the galactic community as a sovereign peer. Its borders were recognized. Its fleet was acknowledged. The joint historical review on the Oort cloud civilizations was written in as a binding commitment, with a 5-year timeline, and in a clause that Laura had pushed for quietly but consistently across the final month of talks. Any species currently under conclave membership had the right to formally request a review of its absorption terms, to be heard by a new joint panel that included human observers. That last clause was the one that changed everything. Within a year of the treaty signing, 3 species had submitted formal petitions. The Aereth Collective was first. The Vashon Union followed 2 weeks later. A smaller species called the Dravathi, who had been inside the conclave for 600 years and had nearly lost their native language in the process, submitted their petition quietly, with a note attached that said they had not known this was possible until they read the human treaty document. Laura Voss attended the first Aerith hearing as an observer. She sat at the back of the chamber and said nothing. She was not there to intervene or to speak. She was there because it mattered to be present, and because presence, she had always believed, was its own kind of statement. The Velthari High Command was not happy about any of it. But the math was still the math. 1,700 human warships had not moved from their positions. The experimental systems list had not been updated, which meant it had not been deployed, which meant humanity was still choosing patience. The High Command could read a data package as well as anyone. Dale Ortiz was not at the signing ceremony. He had not been invited exactly. It was a diplomatic event, and Dale was a soldier, and those were different categories. But mostly he had not pushed to be there because he did not feel the need. He was out on routine patrol near the outer relay points, doing what he always did. Watching, making sure, the work that no one thought about until they needed it. Nina Carr found a bottle of something on the signing day. She had been saving it since her first deployment. A glass bottle with a handwritten label from a small producer somewhere in Oregon. She did not make a speech about it. She just brought it to the command deck after the official confirmation came through and poured small measures into paper cups and handed them around to the handful of crew who happened to be present. Dale held his cup and looked out at the stars for a moment. It was good. Back on Sorveth Prime, Zelthivaris was finishing his formal survey report on humanity. He had been writing it for 4 months, fitting it around his other duties, going back and revising sections when he learned something new. It ran to 412 pages. His colleagues joked that it was longer than any survey report in the department's history, and that he should have just written a book. He ignored them and kept revising. The section the Veilthari Council debated longest was not about warships. It was not about the defensive grid, or the tactical capabilities, or the fleet counts. It was a section near the end of the report, which Zelthivaris had titled simply, On the Nature of Human Contradiction. In it, he wrote about Cal Reeves. He wrote about the video of the dog. He wrote about how Cal had brought food every day without being asked, and how that small act had slowly changed the way Zelthivaris thought about the species holding his ship. He wrote about the fact that humanity had constructed an arsenal powerful enough to threaten the oldest empire in the known galaxy, and had then spent 6 months in a conference room trying very hard not to use it. He wrote about the way human soldiers carried weapons and also photographs of their families. He wrote about a species that had been preparing for war for 200 years, and still, when the moment came, reached for negotiation first. He wrote that in 40 years of field survey across dozens of star systems, he had never encountered a species that was both more capable of destruction and more deliberately committed to avoiding it. And he wrote that in his view, which he acknowledged was only one view, and a recently changed one at that, those two things were not opposites. They were connected. The humans were careful with their strength precisely because they understood what it could do. They had looked at their own history, at all the wars they had fought against themselves, and they had made a choice, not to become harmless, but to become intentional. His last line was simple. He wrote, "They are not a myth. They are not a weapon. They are something the galaxy has not seen before, and we would do well to understand them before deciding we know what they are." The report was distributed to all 17 conclave species within 6 weeks of its submission. It was translated into 31 languages. The section on human contradiction was quoted in 8 separate political speeches in the following year, by 6 different species, across 4 different arguments that had nothing to do with each other. Cal Reeves read it from a screen in his bunk, on a quiet evening shift, 6 months after the treaty signing. He had been promoted twice since the Jupiter containment. He had a framed printout of the last paragraph on the wall above his desk, with one line underlined in ordinary blue pen. When people asked him what first contact was really like, he usually shrugged and said it was mostly waiting, some terror, and one long conversation about dogs. He said it in the easy way of someone who had been part of something large, and was still getting used to that fact. He was, in the way that seemed most natural to him, and most confusing to everyone else, quietly proud. Not of the fleet, exactly. Not of the treaty, or the formation, or the data package that had stopped 46 warships from firing. He was proud of the conversation, the small one, the one that had not been planned or prepared or run through diplomatic channels. Just 2 people, on either side of a screen, trying to figure each other out, and managing, in the end, to do exactly that. That was the part that felt most like humanity to him. Not the warships. The willingness to sit down across from something unknown and say, simply, "Tell me about yourself. I am listening." The galaxy, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, was beginning to understand what kind of species had just walked through its door. It was going to take some getting used to.